I caught only fragments, words slipping past like steam from a cracked kettle. She won't notice, she can't hear. My daughter-in-law's voice, sharp, and my chest tightened because I knew they were talking about me. I am Margaret Doyle, 74. I live on this farm that has been in my family for over a century. Folks, this place is not just land. It is memory. It is my husband's sweat buried in every wooden beam. It is the soil that fed my son when he was small enough to fit in my arms. And now they whisper, hoping I won't catch a word. Hoping my silence means consent. The kitchen smelled of burnt cornbread. The pan still sat on the stove, black edges curling. I pressed my fingers on the table, felt the old grooves my husband carved long ago. My ears buzzed, half deaf, but my eyes caught their faces. Elaine leaning close to Thomas, papers spread flat, their mouths moving quick, secretive. My heart beat like a drum against my ribs. I thought, am I invisible now? Does deafness make me less than human? The irony burned. I raised him, gave him this land, and now he hides like a thief inside my own kitchen. My throat tightened. The words wanted to rise. I hear enough. But I held them down. Sometimes quiet gives more power than shouting. Elaine smiled too wide when she saw me watching. Just insurance papers, Mom, she said. Her voice sweet, too sweet. I nodded, though the air between us felt sour. My son wouldn't meet my eyes. His fingers tapped the pen on the table. Tap, 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 like a guilty metronome. I wondered how many nights they had practiced this lie. The floor creaked under new boots. I turned, and a stranger in a neat suit walked across the living room, glancing at the walls as if measuring. His shoes were too polished for farm dirt. His gaze lingered on the family portrait above the mantel, the one with my husband's gray eyes shining proud. And I thought, dear God, are they already showing my house to buyers? I gripped the chair back. The wood cut into my palm. I wanted to shout, to demand answers. But instead, I watched. Sometimes the prey pretends sleep while the hunters circle. I told myself not yet. Watch first. Their mistake will show. The buzz in my ears grew louder. My body felt cold even as the stove hissed. I could almost smell the ink from those papers, sharp as vinegar. My son slid one page toward me, hiding the title with his hand. Just sign here, Mom. His tone was flat. Not a request. Not love. A command dressed as care. My hand trembled over the pen. My eyes blurred. For a moment, I thought of signing just to keep peace. But peace with betrayal is only surrender. I pulled my hand back. Later. I muttered low. They glanced at each other. Elaine's smile cracked, thin as glass. My son sighed through his nose, a sound of frustration, not patience. And I sat there, heart pounding, ears ringing, tasting bitterness like rust in my mouth. Outside, a crow screamed across the cornfield. Its cry sliced the silence sharper than any blade. I followed that sound with my eyes and thought, crows don't whisper. They announce. Maybe I needed to be a crow. Night fell heavy. I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the cold cornbread. The walls seemed to close in, carrying the faint echo of their laughter down the hall. Betrayal doesn't need shouting. It drips in whispers, in silence, in the weight of papers slid across wood. And I felt the crushing truth. My own flesh and blood planned to erase me while I still breathed. I folded my hands. My skin was paper thin, veins raised blue. Yet inside, a fire sparked. They mistook deafness for weakness. They thought old age meant surrender. But I was still here, and I still owned this soil, these walls, these memories. Quiet does not mean gone. Folks, what would you do if your family whispered you out of your own home? Would you fight back or walk away? Morning light spilled through the kitchen window, landing soft on the old photo frame above the mantel. I reached for it, dust brushing my fingertips, glass cool against my palm. My husband's face looked back at me, younger, steady-eyed, the brim of his hat tilted just enough to reveal his smile. That picture was taken the first summer after we married. The fields behind us stretched green and wild, and we thought the world had no limits. I closed my eyes, and the kitchen around me dissolved. I was 23 again, standing barefoot in fresh soil, my husband laughing as he lifted a wooden beam into place. The barn smelled of pine boards and sweat. His shirt clung to his back, and I remember handing him a cloth, teasing, "You'll melt before this barn is done." He grinned, wiped his forehead, and said, "If I melt, it'll be for this land, for us." That moment burned itself into me like sunlight on skin. The farm was never just property. It was late nights harvesting corn under a dim tractor light, our hands raw but our spirits high. It was the scent of fresh hay after a storm, rain still dripping from the rafters. It was Thanksgiving tables crowded with neighbors, laughter bouncing off the walls, and me serving pies baked from apples we picked with our own hands. Every nail, every fence post, every field was stitched with sacrifice, and I had been proud, so proud, to see my son running barefoot across rows, chasing fireflies while his father's shadow stretched long in the twilight. I can still feel the ache in my knees from those years, the way my back bent low to lift bushels, the way winters gnawed at our bones while we patched roofs and prayed the barn would hold. But through all of it, we held each other. He used to whisper before sleep, "Margaret, this land will outlast us, but it will carry our name." His words wrapped me warm like quilts against the Iowa frost. I clung to them, not knowing how much I would need them when he was gone. After his funeral, I walked the fields alone. The soil smelled of damp earth. The sky hung heavy with migrating geese, and every step felt like walking with his ghost beside me. I promised him then I'd guard this place, no matter what, even as my hearing slipped, even as my body slowed. That vow rooted itself deeper than corn or soybeans ever could. Legacy was not just inheritance. It was memory turned to duty, pain woven into pride. Now, years later, I stand in the same kitchen where his laughter once echoed. The floor creaks the same way under my weight. The fields still roll beyond the window. But the voices I hear are no longer kind. They are whispers sharp with greed, shadows that pretend to love. And my heart breaks, because the land he swore would outlast us is now threatened by the very blood we raised. The evenings were always my favorite. After long days in the fields, we would sit on the porch, the boards still warm from sun, fireflies sparking across the yard. He would rest his boots on the step, tap his knee in rhythm, and hum an old hymn his father taught him. I would lean against him, the smell of tobacco faint on his jacket, and believe the world was steady. He used to say, "Margaret, storms may come, but the ground will always know us." Those words anchored me through countless winters. I remember the night he showed me the folder. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee, steam curling up while he slid a manila envelope across the table. His hand covered mine, rough from years of labor, warm even in silence. "If anything happens," he said, "this makes sure you stay safe. No one can take what we built." I laughed nervously, told him he was too young to worry about such things. But he insisted, his eyes steady. "Promise me you'll keep this safe." I promised. I tucked it away, never thinking how soon it would matter. When he passed, that envelope became more than paper. It was his voice whispering still, his hand guiding mine when I felt too small for the weight of the world. Inside was the will, signed and sealed, naming me guardian of the land. Every page carried his trust. And though grief hollowed me, I held firm, because he had believed in me, even when I doubted myself. Years slipped by. My son grew, found his own life, and I thought the legacy would be safe in his hands. I told myself families honor the past. They do not sell it to strangers. But standing here now, hearing whispers twist in corners, I realized trust can be fragile. The same blood that once ran laughing through these fields now turns cold at the promise of money. I held the photo frame tighter, but my grip faltered. The glass slipped, crashed against the floor. The sound cut through the quiet like a shot. Shards glittered across the wood, my younger self smiling up from a torn corner. I bent slowly, knees aching, and touched the broken edge. My reflection wavered in the glass, eyes clouded yet burning inside. If love built this home, how could betrayal hope to erase it? The lamp in the living room buzzed faintly, its light too dim to chase away the dusk. I sat in my chair, the quilt heavy on my knees, when Thomas walked in holding a stack of papers. His jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the floor. Elaine trailed behind him, her smile thin as frost. He didn't sit. He hovered, shifting his weight, tapping the folder against his leg. Finally he said, "Mom, you can't handle money anymore." Just like that. No soft cushion, no respect in his tone. My breath caught sharp as broken glass in my chest. I stared at him. This was the boy I'd carried on my hip, the boy who once cried over scraped knees in these very rooms. And now he looked at me like a burden, a problem to fix. My hands gripped the quilt, knuckles pale. I wanted to ask him if he remembered the nights I sewed patches on his jeans under a single bulb, or the mornings I packed his lunch with coins I could barely spare. Instead, I swallowed the lump in my throat. Elaine stepped closer, perfume strong, sweet in a cloying way. She set a pen on the table. "It's just a little help, Mom. A signature here, and you won't have to worry." Her voice dripped sugar, but her eyes glittered like glass shards. I reached for the pen, then paused. My fingers trembled, the weight of his words still pressing down. "Can't handle money. Can't handle my life." The air smelled of paper ink, sharp and metallic. Thomas pushed the folder closer. "It's best this way. Simpler." He avoided my gaze, staring at the lamp as if it might offer him courage. My heart sank. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, about erasing my place in the home I had built. I pressed the pen down against the table, not yet to the paper, just to feel something solid beneath my hand. My son's impatience flared. He snatched the pen back, his movement quick, cutting the air. For a moment, the silence roared louder than any storm. I saw in his eyes not the boy I raised, but a man convinced his mother was finished. I leaned back, the chair groaning under my weight. The lamp flickered. Elaine slid the papers across the wood until they touched my wrist. I glanced down. The top sheet bore a title I could only partly read, letters blurred, but I caught enough. "Transfer off!" My pulse thudded in my ears. I didn't move. Not yet. My hand hovered, inches above the page, while my heart hammered out its warning. The papers lay there, a trap dressed in tidy font. And I knew the first insult had landed, but more was coming. Elaine leaned her hip against the table, crossing her arms. "You've done enough, Mom," she said, her tone smooth but sharp. "It's time to let the next generation handle things." The words slithered, wrapping tight around my ribs. Next generation? I was still alive. My blood still ran warm. Yet in her mouth I was already a relic. Thomas stayed near the window, his face half in shadow. He would not meet my eyes. Instead, he fiddled with the curtain cord, twisting it around his finger until it dug white into his skin. Every second of his silence cut deeper than Elaine's polished cruelty. Silence, from my own son, carried more betrayal than her practiced words. The lamp flickered again. The air smelled stale, like dust baked into old curtains. On the table, the papers spread wide, black ink lines waiting for my name. Elaine tapped one page with her nail, a sharp click that echoed in the quiet. "It's simple," she coaxed, her smile tight. "You sign and everything stays safe. Isn't that what you want?" Her words dripped false kindness, a syrup too thick to swallow. My throat tightened. Safe. That word used to mean steady arms around me after storms, my husband's voice promising the land was ours forever. Now it meant surrendering my place, erasing myself from the story we wrote together. I could almost smell the cedar of his old barn jacket, could hear him saying, "Don't let go, Margaret." The memory pressed against me like a shield. Thomas shifted at last. He turned, eyes heavy, but still not meeting mine. "Mom," he said, flat low. "Just sign it, don't make this harder." His words dropped like stones into the room. No warmth, no respect. Only finality. My chest burned. Was I truly nothing more than an obstacle now? The clock on the mantel ticked, loud in the silence. I could hear each second scrape by, as if time itself judged me. My hand hovered near the page. I saw the title clearly this time, Transfer of Property. The letters swam, sharp and merciless. My name was written below, blank space waiting for ink, waiting for me to vanish. Elaine slid the pen closer, slow, deliberate. "It'll be easier for everyone," she murmured. Her eyes glittered, daring me to protest. The pen rolled, stopped against my hand. I felt the chill of metal against my skin, and with it, the weight of a decision that was never mine to make. I pulled my hand back, heart pounding so loud it filled my ears. Their faces tightened. Thomas exhaled, sharp through his nose, frustration leaking out. Elaine's smile cracked, a flash of annoyance breaking through the mask. The papers lay between us, a silent wedge, a trap disguised as help. I looked down at the black ink, at the space where my signature should be, and I knew, with a clarity that stung, this was not a single insult. This was the opening move of something far larger, a betrayal already in motion. The kitchen felt colder than it should have been. A draft slipped through the cracked window, rattling the glass, carrying the smell of damp earth from the fields. I sat at the old oak table, my husband's table, the grain worn smooth from decades of meals and late-night talks. Now it was littered with papers I did not recognize, papers that did not belong. Elaine set them down as if she owned the room. Her perfume clashed with the smell of ink and dust. "Mum, we just need you to look these over," she said, voice silky, too calm. Her fingers spread the sheets like a dealer laying cards in a rigged game. I could see lines of print, black, dense, crawling across the page. Thomas stood behind her, arms crossed. His shadow stretched long on the kitchen wall. He did not speak. He let her carry the words, while his silence pressed heavier than stone. When I glanced at him, he looked away, as if my eyes were fire he couldn't endure. I picked up one page. The paper felt rough, heavier than ordinary bills. My vision blurred, letters swimming. I blinked, but the words would not sharpen. My hand trembled, and I set the page down before I tore it. The lamp above the table hummed faintly, its light yellowing, pooling over the black ink. I whispered, "More to myself than to them? What am I signing?" Pauline leaned closer, pointing at a blank line near the bottom. Her nail clicked against the page. "It's just insurance, Mom. Protection." Her lips curved into a smile, but it was too tight, too controlled. "You don't need to worry about the details." I stared at her hand, pale against the dark ink, and felt my stomach turn. The pen rolled toward me, slow across the wood, stopping at my wrist. My fingers itched to push it away. Thomas's voice broke the silence at last. "Mom, don't make this difficult. It's just paperwork." His tone was flat, rehearsed, as if he had said the line to himself many times before. My throat tightened. Just paperwork, yet it carried the weight of erasure. I reached out, my fingertips brushing the pen. My hand was stiff, bones aching from years of labor. I tried to steady myself, but the pen rattled against the table, a faint, betraying clink. Elaine's smile froze, her eyes narrowing as if she could see the doubt rising in me. The air thickened. I could hear the clock in the hall, each tick pounding against my ribs. My breath came shallow. I pressed the pen tip to the paper, the ink bleeding slightly where my hand shook. The first letter of my name began to form, jagged, uncertain. Then my gaze caught a heading, bold in small print above the line. Transfer of funds. The word stabbed at me. This was no insurance form. This was a theft, dressed in letters. My heart lurched. I pulled the pen back, leaving a black smear across the page. Elaine's smile snapped, sharp as broken glass. Thomas shifted, exhaling hard, the sound of a man losing patience. I pressed my palm flat on the table, steadying myself. The ink smeared under my hand, dark against the wood. I lifted my head, meeting their eyes at last. They thought I hadn't noticed, but I had. Elaine's smile hardened, all pretense gone. She pushed the paper back toward me, her nail scraping against the wood. "Mom, don't overthink it. You can't keep track of these things anymore. That's why we're here." Her words dripped with authority, not care. Each syllable told me exactly what she believed. I was finished. Thomas shifted, his boots creaking on the floor. He would not look at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the far wall, as if avoiding me made the betrayal easier. My chest tightened. I remembered when those same eyes used to light up at Christmas, when he would wait for me to hand him his first slice of pie. Now they avoided me, heavy with shame or calculation. I could not tell which. The lamp above the table flickered, shadows jumping across the wallpaper. I felt smaller under their gaze, as though the light itself conspired to make me invisible. The paper lay flat before me, the smear of my almost signature glaring like a wound. My hand hovered, trembling, but not from age, from rage, from humiliation so sharp it burned behind my eyes. Elaine leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Do you really want to make this harder for Thomas?" "For me? You don't need this land anymore. You don't even hear the phone ring. What good is it to you?" Her words stabbed, deliberate. Not questions, accusations, judgments. The room felt too tight. The air pressed thin. The smell of ink and dust thickened in my nose. I wanted to shout, to slam my hand on the table. But I sat still, nails biting into my palm. Quiet is sometimes the only weapon left. If I screamed, they would call it madness. If I stayed silent, maybe they would reveal more. Thomas finally spoke low, almost muttering. "Mom, just sign it." His shoulders hunched, his voice flat, stripped of any tenderness. The boy I had carried on my back was gone. In his place stood a man willing to erase me for a dollar figure written in black ink. The pen slipped from Elaine's fingers, clattering against the table before rolling onto the floor. The sound rang louder than it should have, metallic against wood. My heart leapt, not at the noise, but at what it meant. Pressure cracking through their performance. For 1 second, I saw the truth. This wasn't about protecting me. It was about cutting me out. I bent slowly, picked up the pen and placed it back on the table. I did not speak. My silence stretched, heavy, a presence of its own. Elaine's jaw tightened. Thomas exhaled through his nose, sharp, impatient. The clock in the hall ticked, relentless, counting every beat of betrayal. I lowered my gaze to the paper again. Transfer of funds, bold, merciless letters waiting to erase me. My throat ached, but I kept still. Not yet. Not here. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I pressed my hand against the table, steady as stone, and let the anger root itself deep. This was not about money alone. This was about erasing my name, my worth, my very place in the story of this land. And as I sat there, quiet, I knew one truth with painful clarity: they had underestimated me. The house had grown quieter than I ever remembered. Not the peace of Sunday mornings or the hush of falling snow. This was a silence that smothered. A silence that pressed into every corner like damp creeping under old boards. When I stepped into the kitchen, the air smelled of last night's casserole gone cold, left on the counter as if no one bothered to clear my plate. Elaine moved through rooms like a hostess in a house that wasn't hers. She opened drawers, rearranged cupboards, scolded me for leaving things the wrong place. Thomas followed her lead without a word. Their footsteps echoed upstairs while I sat downstairs, hearing only the dull creak of floorboards overhead. It felt less like family and more like intruders carving their names into my life. At supper, they spoke to each other, not to me. Elaine's laugh tinkled, rehearsed, while Thomas nodded, fork tapping against his plate. My chair sat at the end of the table, the gravy congealed in front of me. I lifted a spoon once, but no one looked up. It was as though I had faded, a ghost haunting the very house I had built. I tried to busy my hands, folding dish towels, straightening the mail, but the letters blurred, the ink swimming before my tired eyes. The walls seemed to lean closer, heavy with the weight of portraits where smiling faces no longer looked familiar. Even the clock on the mantel mocked me, its tick loud, impatient, reminding me I was simply marking time until they decided I wasn't needed at all. Sometimes I heard them whisper in the hall. Elaine's voice, sharp, clipped. "She's slipping. It won't be long." Thomas murmuring back, low, hesitant. The words weren't meant for me, but even half heard, they sliced. I would stand in the doorway, quilt around my shoulders, watching their shadows move against the wall. They never noticed. Or maybe they didn't care. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. Pale skin, hair thin as corn silk, eyes clouded. For a moment, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Was this what they saw? Someone fragile, someone expendable? My chest ached with the thought. I pressed my palm to the glass, cool beneath my hand, and whispered, "I am still here." The window offered no answer. Days blurred, heavy with silence. I walked the halls like a guest, not a mother, not the matriarch this home once knew. The scent of lavender cleaner stung my nose, Elaine's way of wiping away every trace of me. Even the quilt on my chair was moved, folded too neatly, stripped of its warmth. Then, one evening, when the house had fallen into its usual hush, a new sound broke through. The back door creaked, soft, hesitant. I turned. There she was, Lucy, her hair tucked behind her ear, her eyes bright despite the dim light. She stepped quickly across the room and wrapped her arms around me. The scent of her shampoo, fresh, floral, wrapped me warmer than any quilt. Her breath tickled my ear as she leaned close. "Grandma," she whispered, steady, sure. "I'll help." And for the first time in weeks, my heart lifted. Lucy pulled me gently into the living room, away from the kitchen where the shadows of Thomas and Elaine might still linger. We sat on the old sofa, its springs creaking under our weight. The lamp in the corner cast a weak amber glow, barely pushing back the dark. She held my hands, her grip firm, warm against the chill in my skin. "Grandma," she whispered again, her eyes fixed on mine, "I know something's wrong." Her words came quick, like a secret she'd carried too long. My throat tightened. I wanted to deny it, to protect her from the ugliness unraveling in this house. But the truth pressed against my lips until it escaped in a hoarse murmur. "They're trying to take everything." Her gaze did not flinch. Instead, she leaned closer, her hair brushing my cheek, the faint scent of jasmine from her shampoo filling the air. "I saw the papers," she said. "They aren't what they claim. I don't think Dad even realizes what Elaine's planning. Or maybe he does, and that's worse." The words cut deep. I closed my eyes, my chest heavy with sorrow, heavier still with shame. The clock ticked on the mantel, steady, unfeeling. Each sound hammered the silence. Lucy shifted, pulling a notebook from her bag. She flipped it open, pages already lined with scribbles. "I wrote down everything I overheard," she explained. Her voice carried determination I had almost forgotten could exist in this house. She pointed to a line where Elaine's voice was quoted, sharp. "She won't notice. Just get her to sign." My hands trembled as I traced the ink. We spoke little after that, our voices hushed. Even whispers felt dangerous with walls so thin. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, a low moan carrying through the fields. Lucy brewed tea, filling the room with the calming scent of chamomile. She pressed the cup into my palms, and I felt steadier, the warmth seeping into my bones. "I need you to act as if you don't know," she urged. "Don't give them a reason to hide anything. Let them think you're unaware." I nodded slowly, though the thought stung. Pretending weakness when I already felt erased seemed unbearable. Yet I saw the steel in her eyes, and I knew she was right. Sometimes silence was survival, sometimes patience was power. Elaine's footsteps passed in the hallway upstairs, quick, clipped. Lucy placed a finger to her lips, and we froze until the sound faded. Only when the door shut did she lean close once more. "Grandma, I'll find out everything. I won't let them win." Her whisper was fierce, almost a vow, and in that moment the air in the room changed, less suffocating, more alive. I set the empty cup on the table, its ceramic clink echoing soft. My hands still shook, but no longer from despair. For the first time since the whispers began, I felt a spark, fragile but real. Not hope in myself alone, but in the bond between us. Lucy's hand tightened over mine, steady and sure. The house remained dark, the night heavy, but her words lingered bright. And as the clock ticked on, I knew I was no longer alone. Lucy had stepped into the storm with me. Together, we would face it, and she promised, eyes shining, "We'll uncover the truth." The dining table stretched longer than I remembered, leaves added at the center to fit the crowd. Candles flickered, dripping wax onto the cloth, their light casting shadows across faces I barely knew. The air smelled of roasted turkey gone lukewarm, cinnamon pies cooling too long on the counter. Lauder rose and fell, but none of it wrapped around me. I sat near the end, a plate placed before me but untouched. My fork felt heavy, the gravy congealed. Across the table, Elaine's voice cut clear above the chatter. "Should we bother asking Grandma to say grace?" She can't even hear the words. Her laugh followed, quick, brittle, and the room shifted with it. A hush spread, then small chuckles rose, nervous, complicit. My face burned. I gripped my napkin tight in my lap until my knuckles whitened. The candlelight wavered, blurring my vision. I thought of every Thanksgiving past, my husband carving the turkey, my hands serving slices of pumpkin pie, neighbors lifting their glasses in thanks. Now, I was decoration, a chair filled for show. Thomas didn't speak. He lowered his gaze to his plate, knife pressing into meat, sawing in silence. His cowardice hurt worse than Elaine's cruelty. A son's silence carves deeper than any insult. I wanted him to look at me, to say one word, but he kept his head bowed, as though shame chained his eyes. Elaine clinked her glass with a fork, the sound sharp against the silver. "Everyone," she said brightly, "let's toast to the future. New opportunities, new beginnings. Some of us can't keep up anymore, but that's the beauty of fresh blood." Her eyes slid toward me, gleaming, daring me to react. I kept still, though my chest heaved with the weight of her words. Beside me, Lucy shifted, her hand brushing mine under the table. I felt the edge of something cold and small in her palm. A recorder. She squeezed my fingers lightly, her signal clear. My breath caught, half with fear, half with relief. She was listening for me, capturing every poisoned word. In that silent exchange, strength flickered between us. The clatter of cutlery filled the space Elaine left. Plates passed, chairs scraped, but the warmth of family was gone. The room felt colder than the November wind clawing at the windows. I lifted my water glass, its rim cool against my lip, but I could not swallow. The words in the air had already lodged in my throat. Elaine leaned close to the cousin beside her, stage whispering. She doesn't even notice what's happening. Just nods and smiles. The cousin laughed awkwardly, eyes darting away from mine. The cruelty was not subtle. It was a performance, and the audience was too afraid to leave their seats. I pressed my hands together, nails digging into my palms, blood pounding in my ears. My mind screamed at, "This is my table, my home, my legacy." Yet my voice remained trapped behind clenched teeth. I wondered if this was what dying felt like. Not the stopping of breath, but the erasure of dignity while still alive. Then Elaine lifted her glass higher, her smile wide. "Practiced. To family," she declared. Her voice rang clear, hollow, and the candles flickered low as though even the flames recoiled. The room froze, eyes turning, waiting for me to respond. I did not. I stared back silent, unbroken, though my heart cracked inside. "Folks tell me, when cruelty wears the mask of celebration, would you hold your silence, or would you fight for your dignity?" Elaine's glass clinked against the table once more, sharper this time. She leaned forward, voice carrying down the length of the table. "You know, sometimes I wonder why we keep setting a place here. She doesn't cook anymore. She doesn't host. She doesn't even hear half of what's said." Her smile widened, all teeth. "She's just here." The laughter that followed was hesitant, brittle. A cousin forced a chuckle, then stopped when no one joined. Forks scraped plates, chairs shifted. The scent of turkey skin turned bitter in my nose, as though the cruelty had soared the air itself. I pressed my hand against my thigh, steadying the tremor threatening to rise. Thomas chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on his plate. He didn't defend me. He didn't even flinch, my son silent, complicit. A shadow of the boy who once clung to my apron strings in this very kitchen. My chest burned, tears pressing behind my eyes. But I refused to let them fall, not here. Not in front of Elaine's smirk. Elaine raised her voice, ensuring even the farthest guest would hear. "Honestly, keeping the farm is ridiculous. She can't manage it. She barely manages herself. Better to pass it on to those who know what to do." Her words carved through me like a knife. I felt every pair of eyes flicker my way. Sympathetic, curious, embarrassed. No one spoke. Lucy shifted beside me, her knee pressing lightly against mine under the table. I glanced down and saw the recorder in her lap, the tiny red light blinking. My throat tightened, not with fear, but with a fragile thread of hope. Someone was bearing witness. Someone would remember. Someone would not let this vanish into silence. Elaine turned to a guest at her side, voice pitched high, mocking. "Do you know she once signed a paper thinking it was insurance? Bless her heart." Laughter bubbled at the end of the table, cruel and careless. My cheeks flamed, my nails dug into the cloth napkin until it nearly tore. My mouth opened, then closed again. Words failed me, trapped by a lifetime of dignity that begged me not to scream. The candles flickered, shadows dancing across the walls. Every sound, the clatter of cutlery, the shuffle of feet, seemed louder against the weight of my silence. I swallowed hard, tasting metal. I wanted to vanish from that room, yet some deeper part of me vowed to endure, to remember every syllable hurled my way. Lucy's voice was almost inaudible, a breath against my ear. "Hold on, Grandma." Her fingers tightened around mine under the table. That small anchor kept me steady as Elaine's performance reached its cruel peak. Then, with a shrug, Elaine delivered the line that sealed the room in ice. "She's already gone?" she said, voice sweet, merciless. "Just sitting here out of habit?" The words hung in the air, heavier than stone. The chatter stilled, laughter died, and every eye turned to me. Silence thickened, thick enough to choke. I sat rigid, heart pounding, face pale in the candlelight. I met Elaine's gaze across the table. I did not speak. I did not break. But inside, a vow etched itself deeper with each beat. This humiliation would not be the end. It would be the spark. Tell me, folks, when words cut deeper than knives, is it too far to stay silent, or is justice simply waiting for its moment? The house carried a different quiet after Thanksgiving. Not the noise of guests leaving, but a hollow emptiness, like echoes that never found walls to return. I sat in the parlor, staring at the lace curtains, while Lucy moved softly through the rooms upstairs. Her footsteps were quick, purposeful. She had told me she needed to look, to check what Elaine had left lying around. My chest ached with both pride and fear. Pride in her courage, fear of what she might find. Dust floated in the shaft of light spilling through the window. It made the air seem thick, heavy. I closed my eyes, listening to the faint rustle of papers, the creak of drawers. Every sound sharpened in my ears, my heart thudding louder with each passing second. I felt suspended, as though the house itself was holding its breath. A floorboard groaned above. Then came the sound of a drawer sliding open, followed by the soft shuffle of papers. The smell of old envelopes and dry ink drifted down the stairwell, memory-laden. I thought of my husband's study, how he used to sort bills, hum low while balancing accounts. Now, strangers in my own family rifled through legacies meant to protect me. Minutes stretched long. My fingers tapped against the armrest, a nervous rhythm I couldn't stop. The clock ticked, louder and louder, until the silence broke with the creak of footsteps descending. Lucy appeared at the doorway, her hands clutching a folder thick with loose pages. Her face was pale, eyes wide with something more than surprise. Determination burned there, but also alarm. She set the folder on the coffee table, papers spilling across the wood. Some were bank statements, dates circled in Elaine's neat, cruel handwriting. Others were forms marked with my name, but not in my hand. The ink strokes looked wrong, too neat, too deliberate. My stomach twisted, bile rising. "They used me?" I whispered, voice raw. "They forged me." Lucy pressed her lips together, flipping through the stack quickly. The papers whispered as they turned, their edges dry, brittle. She stopped suddenly, her finger pressing against a line of text. "Grandma, look," she said, sliding the page closer. The words blurred at first, my eyes stinging. But when they cleared, I saw it plain: authorization to transfer assets. Beneath it, a signature meant to be mine. My throat tightened, heat rushing to my cheeks. The room seemed to shrink, the air heavy with betrayal. I reached for the paper, hands trembling. The signature was familiar enough to trick a stranger, but I saw the flaw instantly. My J was never curved that way. My M was slanted, always leaning left. Whoever had written this knew me well, but not well enough. Lucy's hands trembled as she gathered more sheets. "This isn't the only one," she said, voice low, urgent. She laid them out like cards, insurance forms, bank withdrawals, property agreements. Each bore my name in ink that wasn't mine. Each was a theft written on paper. I pressed a hand to my chest, breath shallow. I thought of Elaine's smug smile, Thomas's averted eyes. My world narrowed to the cruel scrawl across the page. The sun dipped lower, light slanting gold through the curtains, dust motes dancing like restless spirits. I felt the weight of every betrayal pressing down, but alongside it, something stirred. Anger. Cold, steady anger that burned cleaner than despair. They thought I was deaf. They thought I was blind. But my hands could still trace ink. My eyes could still see the truth. Lucy froze, her finger resting on one page, her voice breaking the hush. "Grandma," she whispered, her eyes widening as if she'd uncovered a secret too large to hold. She looked up at me, her voice trembling but fierce. They changed everything. Lucy spread the papers across the table, her fingers moving quickly, her breath shallow. The soft rasp of sheets sliding one over another filled the room, a whispering chorus of betrayal. I leaned forward, heart pounding, the lamplight catching the sharp lines of her determined face. Every page was another wound, another theft dressed up as legality. She froze when a folder slipped open, revealing a thin envelope tucked between bank forms. Her hands stilled, eyes narrowing. Carefully, she pulled it free. The paper smelled faintly of dust and cedar, the scent of drawers unopened for years. My chest tightened as I recognized the familiar letterhead, my husband's attorney. Lucy unfolded it, smoothing the creases against her knee. The words glowed in the yellow lamplight, each sentence carved with clarity. It was a copy of the original will, my husband's will. Lucy's voice shook as she read aloud, "All property remains under the guardianship of Margaret Doyle. No transfer, sale, or reassignment shall be valid without her notarized present signature." She stopped, breath-catching. Her eyes lifted to mine, wide and shining. "Grandma, they can't touch it. Not legally. Not without you." The room tilted for a moment, the weight of relief and rage colliding inside me. My throat tightened until tears slipped free, hot and unbidden. I pressed a trembling hand to my lips, remembering my husband's steady voice, his insistence years ago. "It has to be airtight, Margaret, so no one can ever take what's ours." I had nodded then, not realizing how soon that promise would be tested. Lucy squeezed my hand, her warmth steady, anchoring. "They've been bluffing," she said, fierce despite the tremor in her tone. "They tricked you with fake forms, hoping you wouldn't notice. But this—" She tapped the page with her finger, the sound sharp, certain. "This protects you?" I stared at the neat lines of text, the bold stamp of the attorney's office. My husband's name inked at the bottom felt like a hand reaching across years, pulling me back from despair. For weeks I had lived under a fog of helplessness, convinced I was already erased. Now, a sliver of light pierced through. Not freedom yet, not safety, but possibility. The clock on the mantel ticked, steady, patient. The house outside remained still, though I swore the walls themselves leaned in, listening. I thought of Elaine's laugh at the table, Thomas's silence, the way they paraded my weakness before others. Let them, for now. Let them think me feeble, blind, deaf. Inside I was sharpening. Lucy gathered the papers back into the folder, her movements quick but careful. "We can't let them know we found this," she said. Her eyes glinted, determination wrapped in fear. "If they realize, they'll hide more. They'll try harder. But we'll be ready." Her whisper felt heavier than a shout, a secret vow binding us both. I wiped my cheeks with the edge of my sleeve, my breath steadying. My husband's voice echoed in memory, "Stand tall, Maggie. Even in storms, stand tall." I hadn't, not yet. But maybe tomorrow or the day after, I would. Lucy's presence, her unflinching resolve, planted that seed again. We sat in silence, the folder resting between us like a fragile lifeline. The lamp hummed, the air smelled faintly of the jasmine tea Lucy had brewed hours earlier. My pulse slowed, but fire still glowed low inside me. Not the wild flame of anger, but a slow, steady burn. A fuel. Lucy looked at me, her lips pressing into a thin line before she spoke, her voice soft but certain. "This changes everything." The house had gone still long before midnight, but my body refused rest. I lay in bed, eyes open, watching the pale light of the moon stretch across the ceiling. The sheets felt too heavy, the pillow too thin. Every sound sharpened. The tick of the old clock on the dresser, the sigh of wind slipping through cracks in the window frame. My chest rose and fell too quickly, as though sleep had forgotten me entirely. Beside the bed, the lamp was dark, yet I could smell the faint trace of lavender from the pillowcase. Once, that scent lulled me into calm. Tonight it only reminded me of the emptiness beside me, the place my husband used to lie. His voice echoed, memory clear as if he had just spoken of "Stand tall, Maggie. Even in storms, stand tall." I closed my eyes, clutching at the words, though they pressed heavy against my ribs. Images of the Thanksgiving table flashed. Elaine's cruel smile, Thomas's lowered eyes, the ripple of awkward laughter. Shame had burned so deep it still lingered in my skin. And yet beneath it, another feeling pulsed stronger now. Anger, cold, deliberate anger that made my blood run steady instead of frantic. They had thought me helpless. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. They had forgotten who raised this family, who built this house stone by stone. I turned onto my side, staring at the dim outline of the dresser. The moonlight revealed the frame of a photograph. Me and my husband, arms around each other, standing in front of the barn in spring. The memory stung sweetly. He had insisted on leaving the will airtight, insisted I keep every record close. Now I understood why. His foresight had stretched beyond his years into mine. The clock ticked louder, each second a drumbeat in the silence. My hands curled into fists against the blanket. Elaine's voice rang again in memory. "She's already gone, just sitting here out of habit." My lips tightened. Gone? Not yet? Not while I could still breathe, still see, still remember who I was. They had humiliated me, erased me in front of others. But tonight, alone in the dark, I reclaimed something they hadn't noticed. They hadn't broken me. I sat up slowly, the mattress sighing under my weight. My bare feet touched the cold wooden floor, the chill biting, but it woke me sharper than any tea. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, long and still. I stared into them as though they were listening. My voice came rough, whispered to no one but myself. "They won't take me." The words filled the silence, a fragile vow, but once spoken, it hardened inside me. I rose, crossing to the window. The curtains parted with a soft scrape, and the fields stretched out silver under the moon. Rows of earth, barns silhouetted, fences lined like sentries. My land, my life, my legacy. I pressed my hand against the glass, breath fogging the pain. My reflection looked back at me, older, lined, tired, but the eyes shone with something new. Not surrender, resolve. The night refused to end. I lingered by the window until my legs ached, then turned toward the small desk in the corner. Its oak surface was worn smooth from decades of bills, letters, and recipes scribbled on loose sheets. I pulled out the chair, the legs groaning across the floor, and sat with a heaviness that felt less like defeat and more like decision. The drawer opened stiff, its rails resisting, but I forced it. Inside lay a stack of unused stationery, yellowed at the edges, and a pen that still carried the faint tang of ink. I set them before me, the smell of paper and dust rising sharp, grounding. The silence was immense, yet not empty. It hummed with the steady pulse of my heart, with the memory of a man who had once steadied me through storms. I uncapped the pen and let its tip hover. My hand shook at first, the tremor of age and emotion entwined, but once the nib touched paper, a strange calm settled. The scratch of ink filled the room, deliberate, constant. I wrote names. Our lawyers, the banker my husband trusted, the neighbor who still owed us a favor. I wrote numbers, dates, fragments of memory. Each word was a thread, binding me back to myself. The clock ticked steady above me, a companion now rather than a torment. I remembered nights long ago when my husband and I sat here together, his hand over mine as we balanced ledgers. His voice echoed, "Maggie, everything has a place. Order will keep you safe." I whispered his words aloud, as if the sound itself might summon him closer. My throat tightened, but the pen kept moving. The hours bled into each other. My shoulders ached, eyes blurred. Yet the resolve inside me burned brighter with every line I laid down. I was no longer the woman at the table shrinking under Elaine's laughter. I was the woman who once birthed children, who once managed harvests and debts, who once buried her husband and carried on alone. That woman had not vanished. She had only been waiting. The air cooled toward dawn, the draft pressing through the window seam. My candle sputtered low, its flame trembling in the glass dish. Still I wrote, page after page, until the pile shifted from chaos into shape. Notes, reminders, small strategies that looked insignificant but meant everything. Proof I was not done. Proof they could not erase me without a fight. When the first light of morning broke, pale and hesitant, I sat back in the chair. My body throbbed with exhaustion, but my spirit held steady. I rubbed my eyes with the heel of my hand, staring at the neat stack of paper. Outside, the fields glimmered silver in the dawn, my land still mine. Footsteps padded softly behind me. I turned to see Lucy standing in the doorway, hair tangled from sleep, eyes widening at the sight of me hunched at the desk. Her gaze fell to the papers, then back to my face. She said nothing at first, but her lips curved into a small, proud smile. I pushed the top sheet aside and folded my hands across the desk. My voice came low, gravelly from a night without rest, but clear. The storm is mine to face. The morning after my sleepless night, resolve clung to me like a second skin. My body sagged with exhaustion, but my mind moved sharp, deliberate. Lucy and I sat at the kitchen table, mugs of weak coffee between us, the steam curling into the air like a fragile veil. I kept my voice low. One moved quietly. They mustn't suspect. She nodded, her jaw tight with a seriousness beyond her 19 years. Our first step took us into town, to the bank my husband had trusted. The building was modest, its stone steps worn smooth by years of farmers and families keeping their lives in ledgers. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee gone cold and toner from copy machines. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale wash across the waiting room. My heart thudded with each tick of the clock above the teller windows. Lucy did most of the talking. Her voice was calm but firm, steady as she explained we needed statements under my name. I sat beside her, my hands folded tight around my purse, every muscle tense. I felt exposed, as if Elaine might burst through the glass doors at any second. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, typed quickly, the clack of her keys echoing like tiny hammers. Each strike seemed to count down toward revelation. She printed a stack of papers, still warm from the machine, the smell of ink sharp in the air. Lucy slid them into her folder, eyes scanning quickly. Her breath caught, and for a moment her face went pale. "Not here?" she whispered. "We'll look later?" I nodded, tucking the pages close as though they were gold. Outside, the December wind cut sharp against my face. The sky was a flat gray, promising snow. We walked quickly back to the car, silence heavy between us. I could feel Lucy's thoughts racing, though she kept her eyes on the road as we drove back toward the farm. My pulse drummed, waiting, wondering what lay on those pages. At home, we retreated to the parlor, curtains drawn. Lucy laid the papers out across the coffee table, her fingers tracing the columns, numbers, dates, withdrawals. Lines that blurred for me but sharpened in her eyes. She pointed to one in particular, her brow furrowing. "Grandma, look. 10,000 here last month, another 5 before that. Not household expenses?" Her finger tapped again harder. "This is siphoning." My breath stilled. 10,000. 5. Sums that could buy more than groceries or repairs. My mind reeled, picturing Elaine's polished nails, her new clothes, the smug tilt of her head. Was she spending my life away piece by piece? My stomach twisted with rage, but I kept my voice steady. "We'll need proof. Solid proof." The words tasted bitter but necessary. We couldn't confront yet. Not without every weapon ready. Lucy's eyes burned, the light of defiance strong in her. She began marking the statements with a pen, circling suspicious dates, linking them with arrows. The sound of ink scratching across paper filled the room, urgent, relentless. I watched her hand move, my heart swelling with a pride that steadied me. She was my granddaughter, my blood, fighting for me where my own son would not. The clock ticked on. "Steady watching." I leaned back, my fingers gripping the armrest until my knuckles whitened. I would not falter. Not now. Each line of ink, each circle on the page, was another brick in the wall we were quietly building. They thought me weak, invisible. But invisibility had its uses. In silence, plans could grow. Lucy's hands stilled. She looked up, her lips pressed into a line, her voice a whisper cutting through the hush. "Grandma, this is worse than we thought." We didn't stop with the bank. That afternoon, while Elaine busied herself in town and Thomas lingered in the barn, Lucy and I slipped away. The drive into the county seat felt endless, the bare trees passing like watchmen along the roadside. My nerves knotted tighter with every mile, but Lucy's hand on the wheel was steady, her eyes sharp on the gray horizon. The law office sat on a quiet corner, brick darkened with age. I had walked through those doors years ago with my husband, never imagining I'd return without him. The wooden door creaked as Lucy opened it, the scent of polish and old books wafting out. Inside, the air was thick with dust and lemon oil. A lamp glowed dim on the receptionist's desk, casting the whole room in a golden haze. My throat caught. This place held his voice, his careful planning, his stubborn insistence on protection. We were ushered into a small office lined with shelves heavy with binders. The lawyer, Mr. Hensley, rose from behind a desk worn smooth by decades of elbows and ink stains. His hair was thinner now, his frame more stooped, but his eyes lit when they found mine. "Margaret Doyle?" he said softly, as if speaking to a ghost. "It's been a long time." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Lucy explained quickly. "Documents, signatures, possible fraud." Mr. Hensley listened without interruption, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. At last, he opened a drawer and withdrew a folder, sealed and stamped. He slid it across the desk with care. "Your husband left this here for safekeeping." The original will, notarized, unalterable. The folder was cool under my hand, solid as stone. Relief surged, mingled with sorrow so deep it nearly undid me. He had thought ahead. He had thought of me. We left the office under a sky bruised with clouds. The folder locked in Lucy's arms. Back at the farm, I forced myself into the rhythm of the evening. Elaine's car crunched the gravel drive, and Thomas followed her into the kitchen. I greeted them with a soft smile, stirring stew on the stove as though nothing in the world had shifted. My hands betrayed me, trembling faintly as I ladled soup into bowls, but I kept my tone gentle. "Dinner's ready, dears." Elaine eyed me with her usual suspicion, but she said nothing. That silence was my victory. The clink of silverware, the murmur of their voices, the hum of the refrigerator, it all blurred. I nodded when appropriate, forced a small laugh when Elaine remarked on town gossip. Inside, though my mind burned, the folder hidden upstairs, the bank statements tucked away, the truth waiting gathering strength. Each polite smile I gave was a mask, each lowered gaze a shield. They thought me docile, they thought me broken. But behind the quiet, my roots were deepening. Later, when I lay in bed, the house sunk in darkness, I whispered the vow again. My husband's voice felt near, steadying me. I wasn't moving rashly, not yet. Every step had to be careful, unseen. But momentum was mine now, not theirs. The plan had started, and with Lucy beside me, I was no longer adrift. I stared into the shadows until they blurred, a thin smile curving my lips. They'll never see me coming. The day arrived colder than any before it. Frost clung to the window panes, glittering like shards of broken glass. I dressed slowly, hands trembling not from weakness but from anticipation. Lucy hovered nearby, her presence a steady anchor. "You're ready?" she said softly. I gave a short nod. Ready or not, this was the day everything would break open. The county office smelled of polish and old stone, its hallways echoing with footsteps. We walked through, the heels of Lucy's boots sharp against the tile, the weight of my husband's folder pressed tight to my chest. My breath clouded the air even indoors, a reminder of the winter outside. But the true chill came from within. Fear sat heavy in my stomach, yet under it pulsed something fiercer, resolve. The meeting room waited at the end of a narrow corridor. Its door was propped open, voices spilling out, too loud, too certain. I paused just short of the threshold, peering inside. Around the long table sat Thomas, Elaine, and two strangers in suits far too sleek for this small town. Contracts were spread across the glossy surface, pens poised, coffee steaming in styrofoam cups. Elaine's laugh rang sharp, brittle as glass. "She'll sign whatever I put in front of her," she said, unaware of my presence. My heart thudded, but I held steady. Lucy touched my elbow, her whisper low. "No." The lawyer stepped forward first, his figure calm, composed, his briefcase clicking shut with a final snap. Then I moved, slow but deliberate. The room seemed to shift, heads turning, chatter halting mid-word. The click of the door shutting behind me sounded louder than thunder. Elaine's smile froze, sliding into confusion, then something harsher. "Mother," she said, her tone stretched thin. What a surprise! Thomas stared at me as if I were a ghost, his face pale, lips parted but speechless. I took another step, the sound of my shoes on the floorboard steady. My chest rose with each breath, though inside my heart pounded so loud, I feared it might give me away. I laid the folder on the table with careful hands. The paper whispered against the wood, but the silence that followed was deafening. My lawyer cleared his throat, breaking it. "Before any signatures are exchanged, My client has evidence to present. He opened the folder, revealing the notarized will, its stamp bold and unassailable. No sale, no transfer, can be valid without Mrs. Doyle's consent. And she has not consented. A stunned hush fell. The investors shifted, exchanging wary glances. Thomas's jaw clenched tight, a vein throbbing at his temple. Elaine reached for the contract, flipping through pages too quickly, as though words might change if read fast enough. My palms dampened, but I straightened my back. For weeks, I had bent under their schemes. No more. The fluorescent lights above hummed, harsh and unyielding. Papers rustled like dry leaves, contracts suddenly meaningless. I let my gaze sweep across them all. My son, his wife, the strangers who thought to own what I had built. My throat ached, but my voice, when it came, was steady. This land is mine. It was always mine. I felt the weight of years in that moment, not as a burden, but as armor. My husband's foresight, Lucy's courage, my own stubborn will, they wrapped around me like steel. My breath came steady now. My heart slowed, no longer frantic but sure. I was no longer invisible. I was the storm breaking into their fragile room. And with that, I stepped fully into the light. The silence stretched until it cracked. Elaine was the first to recover, her chair scraping back sharply against the floor. The sound jolted through the room. She leaned forward, eyes narrowed, lips curling into a practiced sneer. "She doesn't know what she's holding," she said, voice dripping with false calm. "She barely hears half of what's spoken these days. Mother, you're confused? These papers are old." My lawyer's hand rested on the folder, steady as stone. "Old or not, notarized originals stand. This will is binding." His tone was crisp, final. Elaine's jaw tightened, her fingers drumming against the contract before her. The fluorescent light overhead threw hard shadows across her face, deepening the lines around her mouth. Thomas shifted uneasily in his seat. His tie sat crooked, sweat beading at his temple. He couldn't meet my eyes. I studied him, the boy I'd once carried in my arms, now a man who sat silent as his wife carved my life away. A bitter ache swelled, but I pressed it down. He had made his choice. So had I? My lawyer opened another folder, this one filled with the bank statements Lucy and I had gathered. He spread them across the table, pages rustling like dry leaves. The smell of toner clung to them, sharp, metallic. "Withdrawals," he said, tapping a finger on one line. 10,000, then 5, then more, consistent, unauthorized, all tied to joint accounts, Mrs. Doyle never approved. The sound of his pen tapping echoed in the tense room. Elaine snatched one of the sheets, scanning it with eyes too quick, lips pressed tight. "This proves nothing," she snapped. "Household costs." "Repairs, medical bills?" I cut her off, my voice low but firm. "No roof costs 10,000. No doctor's visit drains a farm." The words steadied me, stronger with each syllable. Elaine froze, caught off guard by the edge in my tone. For years she had dismissed me as frail, soft-spoken. Not today. Lucy shifted beside me, silent but fierce, her presence like a hand at my back. "Mr." Hensley slid another document forward, a notarized affidavit, signed by the bank officer we'd met just days before. "Testimony confirms these withdrawals were neither requested nor authorized by Mrs. Doyle. Any claim otherwise would be perjury." The investors looked uneasy now, their earlier confidence dissolving. One cleared his throat, pushing his coffee aside untouched. Papers shuffled, the glossy contracts suddenly fragile. Elaine's hands trembled as she shoved the statements back across the table. Her mask of control slipped. Her voice cracked when she spoke again. "You weren't supposed to know." The words slipped into the air, sharp and raw, and for a heartbeat the room stood frozen around them. The words hung in the air, raw, unguarded, damning. Elaine's face blanched as though she wished she could drag them back into her throat. But it was too late. The investors exchanged sharp glances, their polished confidence cracking like thin ice. One cleared his throat, muttering, "This complicates things." His pen slipped from his fingers, clattering against the table in the heavy silence. I rose slowly from my chair, my palms pressed flat against the cool wood of the table. The scrape of my chair's legs rang like a declaration. My knees wavered, but my spine held straight. I let the silence stretch before speaking, my voice steady, loud enough to cut through the hum of fluorescent light. You plotted in whispers, thinking I could not hear. You schemed on paper, thinking I could not read. But I am still here, and this land, this farm, is mine. Elaine's lips twisted into a snarl. She shoved the contracts aside, the paper fluttering to the floor. "This is ridiculous," she's senile. She doesn't even understand what she's saying. Her voice climbed higher, shrill and desperate, bouncing harshly off the cold walls, but her outburst only sealed the truth. No control, no grace. Just fear. Mr. Hensley adjusted his glasses, his voice cool. "I advise you all to reconsider. Any attempt to move forward on this sale would constitute fraud. Criminal charges could follow." The investors stiffened. One pushed his chair back, its legs screeching across the tile. He stood, straightened his suit, and shook his head. "We're done here." The other followed quickly, gathering his briefcase, muttering under his breath as he left the room. The door shut with a dull thud, final as a gavel. Thomas sagged in his chair, his shoulders slumped forward, his eyes met mine at last, wide, hollow, ashamed. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked small, not the man who had conspired, but a boy who'd lost his way. My chest ached with a sorrow I could not speak. Still, I did not bend. Elaine lunged for him, fingers digging into his sleeve, her voice a hiss. "Say something? Fix this?" But Thomas only lowered his gaze to the floor, silent. Elaine's fury turned back to me, hot and venomous. "You've ruined everything." She spat, her breath sharp, her hands trembling. I lifted the folder from the table, tucking it firmly beneath my arm. Her rage no longer touched me. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in with the stench of cold coffee and paper dust. My heartbeat slowed. The storm had broken, and I was still standing. I turned, the floorboards groaning beneath my steps, Lucy at my side. She slipped her hand into mine, her grip warm, steady. Together we walked toward the door. At the threshold, I paused, letting my gaze sweep once more across the wreckage. Contracts scattered, chairs askew, my son wilted in silence, my daughter-in-law frozen in fury. Then I lifted my chin. My voice was quiet but unshakable. "This farm lives with me." The words fell like stone, final and immovable. We stepped into the hallway, leaving their silence behind. The drive back to the farm was silent. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes drifting across the windshield, melting into streaks of water that blurred the fields. I sat in the passenger's seat, folder clutched against my chest, my breath fogging faintly on the glass. Beside me, Lucy kept both hands on the wheel, her lips pressed into a thin line. Neither of us spoke. Words felt too small for what had just broken open. When we pulled into the gravel drive, the farmhouse loomed against the pale sky, its windows dark. The barn doors swung gently in the wind, creaking like old bones. I stepped out slowly, boots crunching in the thin layer of snow. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a prisoner returning. I felt steady. Worn but steady. Inside, the air was cold, faintly tinged with the smell of ash from the old stove. I lowered myself into the wooden chair at the kitchen table. The same chair I had sat in when they whispered behind my back. Lucy lit the stove, the click of the lighter loud in the hush, and soon a faint warmth began to spread. She stirred a small pot, the scent of oatmeal rising, sweet and comforting. "Eat, Grandma," she said softly, sliding the bowl toward me. I nodded, spoon in hand, but my appetite was thin. Still, the taste was grounding, warmth against the chill that clung inside. The house itself felt changed. The walls no longer carried their voices, the sharp laughter, the impatient sighs. Only silence remained, stretching long. My heart ached at that silence. It was lonely, but it was mine. I let my hand drift across the tabletop, feeling the grooves left by years of family meals, by my husband's hands fixing loose boards, by children once pounding fists in play. This was the weight of memory, heavy, but real. Later, I climbed the stairs slowly, Lucy's steady tread behind me. The hallway creaked with each step, the wallpaper faded, the smell of dust and pine lingering. In my bedroom, I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the quilt folded neatly across it. My husband's quilt. My hands trembled as I unfolded a corner, pressing it to my cheek. For a moment, I let myself feel the sorrow I had pushed away. The betrayal of my son, the venom of his wife, it cut deep. But beneath that sorrow was another truth. I was still standing. The farm was still mine. Lucy sat beside me, her hand finding mine. "You did it," she whispered. Her voice was quiet, almost reverent. I turned to her, meeting her eyes. "No," I said softly. "We did it." She smiled, and in that smile I found something stronger than victory: continuity, legacy. The wind howled outside, rattling the window pane. I rose and walked to the glass, pressing my palm against the cold surface. Beyond the fields, snow drifted, the horizon lost in white. My reflection stared back, lined, tired, but unbroken. I let the words slip past my lips, a vow to the empty air. It's not over, but I am free. The next morning, the house was still. I woke to the sound of nothing, no footsteps in the hall, no hushed whispers through the kitchen door. Thomas and Elaine were gone. They had left without a word, their absence a hollow that echoed louder than their presence ever had. For a long moment, I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the quiet. It wasn't sharp with betrayal anymore. It was soft, spacious waiting. Downstairs, Lucy was already sweeping, the bristles of the broom rasping against the old wooden floor. Dust swirled in the morning light that streamed through thin curtains, turning the air golden. I joined her slowly, my slippers brushing across the boards. "It feels empty?" I murmured. She looked up, her smile small but certain. Empty can be good. Empty means room to fill. Together we moved through the rooms, gathering the traces they'd left behind. Half-empty mugs, a sweater draped carelessly on a chair, papers folded and abandoned. The smell of stale perfume lingered faintly, mingled with the damp scent of wood that hadn't felt a good airing in weeks. We opened the windows, letting cold air rush in, sharp and clean. Curtains fluttered, light widening across the floorboards. It felt like the house itself exhaled. In the kitchen, Lucy set water to boil, the kettle ticking as it warmed. The sound was ordinary, but it steadied me more than grand victories ever could. I wiped the counters, fingertips brushing across familiar nicks and scratches. Every mark held a memory: Thanksgiving pies, birthday cakes, long nights of canning peaches with my husband. These weren't just surfaces, they were pages of a life, worn but enduring. When the kettle whistled, Lucy poured 2 cups of tea, steam curling upward like gentle smoke. We sat together at the table, hands wrapped around warm mugs. She studied me, her eyes searching. "What now?" she asked. The question lingered, heavy but honest. I sipped the tea, its heat blooming in my chest. "Now," I said slowly, "we make it ours again. We mend what they tried to break." We spent the afternoon sorting drawers, folding linens, restoring order. I paused often, touching old photographs, running fingers across frames. My husband's smile looked back at me from one, steady and sure. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was failing him. I felt like I was honoring him. Lucy carried boxes upstairs, her laughter echoing faintly as she uncovered forgotten trinkets. The sound filled the space, chasing shadows from corners. By late day, the light softened, painting the walls in shades of amber. I stood by the window, watching snow drift across the fields, the horizon stretching wide and endless. The farm no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a promise, one I could still keep. My reflection in the glass was tired, yes. But there was something steadier now in my eyes. Resolve. Continuity. Behind me, Lucy set another log on the fire, the crackle and pop filling the room with warmth. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. The quiet, the order, the space reclaimed. When I opened them again, I smiled faintly, a whisper forming in my chest and escaping into the air. Tomorrow begins on my terms. Spring came slowly to Iowa, the snow retreating in patches, leaving dark earth exposed and hungry for seed. Each morning, I opened the kitchen window, letting cool air drift in, carrying the scent of damp soil and the sharp cry of crows circling the fields. The farm was alive again, not because of what had been saved on paper, but because I could feel its pulse in every breath. Lucy and I worked side by side, clearing branches, raking leaves that had lain pressed under ice. Her laughter carried across the yard, mixing with the scrape of metal on stone, the rustle of brittle weeds. My hands ached, the joints stiff, but the ache was clean. It reminded me I was still strong enough to tend what was mine. When we paused, she brought out mugs of tea, steam rising into the crisp air. I wrapped my fingers around the cup, savoring the warmth. "Feels different," she said. I nodded. "Because it is ours again." The farmhouse itself seemed to breathe easier. Curtains billowed with the breeze. Dust had lifted from the shelves. On quiet afternoons, I sat by the window with my journal, ink flowing across pages in slow, deliberate strokes. I wrote not only about what had been taken and returned, but also about what still could be. Memory had weight, yes, but it also had wings. Legacy wasn't just land, it was the stories carried forward, the resilience passed down. One evening, as the sun lowered, Lucy joined me on the porch steps, her knees pulled to her chest. The horizon stretched wide, painted gold and rose. She turned to me, her voice careful. "I want to finish my degree, Grandma, but I don't want to leave you alone." I reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "You won't. This place will hold me, and I will hold it, until you're ready to carry more." Her eyes shone, a mix of relief and determination. In that moment, I saw not just my granddaughter, but the thread of continuity my husband once dreamed of. Later that night, the farmhouse was quiet, the fields dark under a sliver of moon. I sat at the desk by my bed, journal open. The ink pooled steady beneath my pen as I wrote the words I had waited months to speak. This farm is more than land. It is our beginning. I closed the book, set the pen aside, and let the silence settle around me. Not heavy now, but full, like soil ready to bloom. By summer, the farm no longer felt like a fortress against betrayal. It had become something larger, a place to gather, to begin again. On Saturdays, children from the town arrived with their teachers, small hands eager to press seeds into the earth. Their laughter carried across the fields, high and bright, mixing with the hum of cicadas in the heat. I walked among them slowly, pointing out the rows, my voice steady. "Patience," I told them, "is what makes roots strong." They nodded as though I'd spoken a secret, and perhaps I had. Lucy organized afternoons where neighbors brought baskets of food, pies steaming with blueberries, bread still warm. The farmhouse kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon, butter, and earth carried on boots. People lingered, sharing stories, sipping sweet tea at the table that once held whispered betrayal. Now it held open hands, open voices. I sat among them, not as a figure to be dismissed, but as one whose presence mattered. My silence had ended. Evenings stretched long on the porch, golden light falling across the fields. Lucy played the old guitar, her voice soft, weaving through the breeze. I leaned back, quilt across my knees, listening. The land no longer felt heavy on my shoulders. It felt anchored, held in trust by both of us. Every day I saw more clearly legacy is not locked in paper, it grows in people who remember, who carry forward. I kept writing in my journal, filling page after page. Not just what had been lost and reclaimed, but the lessons that came after. How betrayal taught me the value of resilience. How silence, once my prison, became my strength when I chose the moment to speak. I left space between the entries knowing Lucy, or perhaps another, would one day continue the story. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long, I stepped into the field alone. The stalks rustled around me, the air warm and alive. I breathed deeply, tasting earth, hearing the chorus of crickets rising with night. The farm spread wide in every direction, not as burden, but as promise. I thought of my husband, of the boy I had raised, of the girl now grown beside me. All threads in the same fabric, frayed but unbroken. I lifted my face to the fading light, letting it wash across the lines of my skin. The words rose without effort, simple and true. This legacy will outlive me. And in that moment, I knew it already had. Looking back now, I see the storm for what it was. A test of roots. Betrayal tried to cut me down, to strip me of dignity and leave me voiceless. Yet the farm still stands, and so do I. Silence, once their weapon, became my shield until the moment I chose to break it. Justice was not loud, but it was steady. And when the truth came, it rang clearer than any shout. Thomas and Elaine are gone from my life, their absence sharp but necessary. I grieve the son I thought I had, but I will not carry his shadow. What remains is stronger, the echo of my husband's care in every beam of this house, the laughter of Lucy as she moves with confidence across these fields, the voices of neighbors who now gather not to take, but to share. This land no longer feels like a battleground. It feels like a beginning. I am 74, but my story is not over. Each season turns. Each seed planted carries more than food. It carries resilience, memory, continuity. My legacy is not just acres of earth, but the strength to rise, to reclaim, to hand forward something unbroken. When I walk these rows, I feel my husband beside me, my granddaughter beside me, and a quiet chorus of every sacrifice that built this soil. This is my justice. This is my healing. And this is my legacy.